Are the aliens we call the tall whites repairing their scout crafts here on Earth using man-made auto parts? Charles Hall tells a story from when he claimed to be the weatherman covering the territory of the secretive Area 51 base in Nevada. Is he believable?
I believe their scout craft and their deep spacecraft had a double hull construction. And for example, in the case of the scout craft, in between those two hulls, they had what appeared to be 1,000 miles of fiber optic windings. They built the scout craft using materials supplied them by the U.S. Air Force. The scout craft were clearly built here on this Earth. When you went on board, many of the parts, like the seats, still had the mold markings of American manufacturers like Lockheed, Boeing, the overhead compartments by Airstream, and so on. And so therefore, it had to be perfectly possible to build a scout craft with its anti-gravity drive using ordinary American parts. The scout craft had the fiber optics windings came in several sets, and the way it worked is it worked in a manner philosophically the same as an electromagnet. It's just that they did not, in an electromagnet you use electrons on copper, going down copper wires and coils. Instead, instead of electrons, they used some other subatomic particle. I'm not sure which one. It's my understanding that there are 3 different ones, or maybe 5 different ones, perhaps mesons or bosons or those subatomic particles, and then that put out anti-gravity. The particle generators looked like batteries, where there was one that would create the particles and accelerate them into the fiber optics, and then the fiber optics amplified the anti-gravity field the same way that an electromagnet amplifies the electric field or the magnetic field. And then there was another one that picked up the particles. Of course, they had to be refueled after, they had to be recharged just the way a battery has to be recharged. The same technology was used on their suits, the ones that allowed them to levitate. And if they were running the suit at full power and they came out from their rest area at 11:30 at night, then by 5:30 in the morning, the suit was almost out of power. So that the batteries they had on their suits would only last 6 hours or so. The batteries on the deep spacecraft obviously also had a limit to how long, had to be recharged periodically. Although I'm not sure how long that limit was, but it perhaps depended on the craft. The deep spacecraft would arrive and leave on schedule, and the shortest schedule was 2.5 months. The longest schedule that I saw was 5 years. So they had to be able to carry fuel to recharge the batteries for that long, or their technology had to allow the batteries to be recharged for that long. But they did have to be recharged. You did have to periodically stop and put in a new power source. The outer set of coils served to streamline the craft for travel within space itself. And when the outer set of coils were powered up, it also protected them from the forces of acceleration and deceleration. As I described in book 2, it was common to see the scout craft, if it were sitting out in the desert some distance, and perhaps say 3 miles, when it was sitting there unpowered, it would just look like a white ellipsoid with windows and the way you'd expect. When they powered up the outer set of coils, it would take on a fuzzy appearance. The outer field obviously protected them from radiation in space as well. Then when they lifted up off the desert, if they had the outer coils energized, they were capable of tremendous performance. It was common to see the scout craft accelerate from 0 to 8,000 miles an hour, travel just a short distance, like 7 miles or 10 miles, stop and set down again, and then turn off the coils. The people on board didn't belt themselves in, they just sat in chairs the way we do, because they didn't feel the force of acceleration. If they did not have the coils powered up, however, if they were bringing the scout craft in real close, like if they were going to park it beside the Range 3 lounge, they would turn off the outer set of coils while they were still some distance away, because the field coming off that outer set of coils extended a great distance from the craft. Of course, before they turned off the coils, they would first slow to maybe 3 or 5 miles an hour, and then once they turned off the coils, then they drove it like a baby buggy, okay? Then they just came in real slow and landed like at 2 or 3 miles an hour. And when they took off, if they hadn't charged up the coils, then they would be traveling just 2 or 3 miles an hour. They'd be traveling like a baby buggy. And they wouldn't, but it wasn't until they'd powered up that other set of coils that they would start doing high-speed performance. The Scout craft was made completely out of American parts and looked like an RV trailer. When you went on board, it was ellipsoidal, and the Scout craft was white with windows on both sides, and more windows. The door, when you looked at the front of when you were standing looking at the front of the Scout craft, the door was on that craft was on the right. Since they were all made here, there was a number of different variations in the design, and the windows on that side extended further back than on the left side. There were no windows on the back, none on the top, none on the bottom, and only one door, the one on the right, which opened from the top, and much like a Learjet, or some Learjets. When you went on board, there was a bulkhead about a third of the way back. In front of the bulkhead on all the Scout craft, the design was the same. There were 5 seats without seat belts that you just sat in. The tall whites are not built strong like we are, and so the idea of belting themselves in would damage their bodies. There was 2 seats for the pilot and the co-pilot, and then 3 other seats in the front. And they weren't very interested in showing me the cockpit area. They said there wasn't much about it that I would understand anyway. On the bulkhead, there was a set of panels. Nowadays, we consider it old hat, switches that don't move like you have on microwave ovens. But in the 60s, that was considered pretty avant-garde, even though I realized that the first motionless switch was actually copyrighted in more or less about 1929, but they weren't in common use. On each switch there were a set of icons. Now we consider that old hat too, because you buy your car and there's icons. But in the 60s that was considered pretty avant-garde. The icons were pretty ordinary. One controlled the outside lights and it looked like the sun. One controlled the inside lights. And so in terms of the icons, there wasn't, or the hieroglyphs on the switches, they weren't very different than, say, hieroglyphs on the Egyptian pyramids or the icons that you see on a modern-day automobile. Behind the bulkhead, there were at least 3 or 4 different designs depending on which model of the Scout craft you were looking at. In the RV model, the one that on that day that I was on, what was behind the bulkhead was an ordinary RV. When you went in there and you were looking towards the back, on the right there was a microwave oven, only where the aliens had taken off the mechanical door and put on a different cover with coils around it. And then when they turned on the oven, they first turned on the coils, and the coils put out the standard field and prevented the microwaves from going through that field into the room beyond. So it looked like a little cave where you'd turn it on and then turn it off, and you didn't have to fiddle with the door, you see. In the back was the latrine, just like in an RV. On the left, they had the seats where you would eat, but also they had hammocks where the children would sleep. And then they had the overhead compartments and a few storage things in the back, although not a great many of them. And then on the bulkhead in the front, they had a mirror and a makeup table where the teacher would put on her stuff. And it was all pretty ordinary. That was the RV model.